This final point is that a couple of things. This is showing the average age of bots over time. And what you want to take away from here, a couple things. First off, the average age of the bots is increasing over time. So that means that bots are, the bots that were created earlier still seem to be working in this kind of political sphere over the course of the whole time. So it's not that we've just seen earlier generations retired and then by looking at these types of bots that we can detect with our method, we're missing some next-gen thing that's doing most of the work. That's one thing. The second thing that's interesting about this is, in general, the pro-Kremlin bots are actually younger than the pro-opposition bots. So if this is a story about, as we've written in another piece in the Journal of Democracy, if this is a story about regimes trying to figure out how to react to the fact that opposition is using technology, the fact that they're a little bit younger than the pro-opposition bots suggests that that's the case. The final thing I think to take away from this here is that because this is going up, we still see, these bots are still playing a role in what's going on here. Anyway, so I'm happy to answer questions later, but thanks very much for your time, and I'll pass it along to our next panelist.
Thank you. Is Alexandra Yatsyk, currently visiting researcher at the University of Warsaw.
So I will continue Joshua's topic, but in more generalized perspective. And in my memo, I focusing on different policy, cyber policy strategies which Russia employs abroad and at home. And I particularly focuses on two cases, mostly on the second one. The first one is about Russia's influence, Russia's invades on 2016 president election, and then the second case is about Telegram's banning, unsuccessful Telegram's banning. And I would like to generalize these two strategies and would like to see how these strategies are employed by Russia. So for all controversies that the first US-Russian President summit on July in Helsinki generated, it was noteworthy that with regard to Putin's brief mention of the idea of US-Russia cybersecurity task force. And to be sure, it was floated a year earlier by the President Trump, when in one of his tweets he noted that the two sides discussed the creation of so-called cyber security unit to safeguard against election hacking. But only a few days later, in what has become a familiar patterns of reversals, Trump appeared to backtrack because it caused bipartisan uproar on the Capitol Hill, hinting that nothing went beyond discussions. So the Russian government has been pushing for talk on cyber security with US for some time now, and on 19 July, Putin's envoy for international cooperation in information security, Andrei Kyrgyz, revealed that the US government offered apologies for not sending a group of experts to the cyber talks, which were supposed to take place in Geneva in February. So paradoxically, even the US intelligence community pointed finger directly at the Russian government in January 2017, accusing it of interfering in the US president election in 2016. This has done little to dissuade the Kremlin from entertaining ambitious cybersecurity cooperation agenda with US. And if you look at strategies which Russian government uses against United States or abroad, so we will see a wide range of cyber tools. For example, from the famous now St. Petersburg troll farms of Putin's personal chief Yevgeny Prigozhin to highly skilled hacker groups such as, for example, Energetic Bill. But perhaps the most well-documented recent case of the Russian cyber attack is that of the NotPetya ransomware that affected mainly Ukraine in June 2017 and was blamed by both United States and UK on Russia. But proving the connection between the cyber activities and the Russian government is very difficult, even for such hacker groups as the Sandworm, that is believed to be controlled by Russia's military intelligence GRU, and Kremlin and Putin himself emphatically and repeatedly denied Russian government's involvement in cyber attacks, including Putin's statement at the Helsinki summit in July. So, if we are looking at what's going on in Russia at home, we can see that Russian government's aggressive approach to exploring cyber vulnerabilities abroad sharply contrasts with restrictions of online freedom at home. In May this year, Maria Matuzhная, a 23-year-old native of Barnaul, faced up to 6 years in prison on accusation of extremism for posting a couple of memes on Vkontakte social platform. So this is one of the pictures he posted with the famous expression that roads and idiots, fools are the key problems of Russia, дороги идиоты, главная беда России. And these just several satiric pictures with Orthodox processions, priests and Jesus Christ that she reposted on her page in even 2015 were deemed sufficiently offensive to charge Maria under Article 232 of the Criminal Code, which targeted hate speech. And Maria was indicated for supporting extremist activity, although she suggests that the real reason for her persecution was her volunteering for Alexei Navalny. And another very similar case also happened in Barnaul is a case of Danila Markin, who faced the same accusation in 2017. So Markin also posted memes with Jon Snow, a very popular character of the Games of Thrones, with a halo around his head, and that was sufficient to be charged for online extremism. And these are only a few examples of such cases from the increasing number of cases in recent years. And most of them have occurred on Vkontakte social networking platform developed by Pavel Durov, who was forced to relinquish its management in 2013 due to his conflict with Federal Security Service. In April, the Russian online regulator unsuccessfully attempted to ban Telegram. And this instance demonstrated the emergence of two, I would say, dominant trends in Russian government domestic cyber policy in the future. The first is that the Kremlin will intensify its surveillance activity online with increasing focus on the young audience as its main target. Because of participation of so-called Putin's generation in the anti-government protest in March 2017, which actually was a key target group of Navalny supporters. The second strategy is that the Russian government actually failed to ban Telegram, and this case revealed its technical and financial limitations in enforcing sweeping online restrictions while causing considerable financial losses to many Russian companies. Seen from this perspective, and also very important to say that the new state program on cyber economy, which is about $48.3 million, was launched by the government at the end of March. And seen from this perspective, also Telegram is testing its own blockchain platform, which is planned to be operationally already this fall, might seriously undermine the Kremlin's plan for the total surveillance of the Russian cyberspace. And this implies that the Russian government's effort to create its own version of so-called China's Great Firewall are unlikely to succeed due to significant cost involved. And instead, I would say that authorities have opted to pursue the haphazard Iranian model of content policing through the court system, so which result in the draconian punitive measures against Russian citizens. And if we look again at these strategies which the Kremlin uses abroad and at home, so I would say that first, while on the foreign policy side, while denying election interference, Kremlin using freedom of expression to convince Western audiences that efforts aimed at restricting Russian state propaganda activities are not democratic. So, for example, the head of Russia Today, the famous TV propagandistic channel, Margarita Simonyan, has utilized this tactic against attempts to characterize her news agency as Kremlin's mouthpiece. So second, instead of admitting collective responsibility, the Russian leadership makes references to individual initiative of concerned citizens. And this was notable at the Helsinki summit when Putin described 12 Russian citizens who are currently under US investigation because of Russia's interference as allegedly helping Trump to win his presidential election of personal sympathies, which is remarkably similar to what Putin said with reference to Russian military personnel in eastern Ukraine, for instance. And this aggressive cyber behavior abroad is very likely intent to compel the United States to the new rules of the game in the cyber domain. And this in turn serves Putin's ultimate strategic objective to be on par with the US. And the diffusive nature of Russia's state's control cyber activities provide the optimal context for this plausible deniability, and it caught both the United States and Europe largely unprepared due to the very character of the Western democratic institutions that tend to be slow in generating policy response. And if in foreign policy the cyber factor is used by Russia for undermining and blackmailing the West to sit down at the negotiation table, in the domestic affairs it is utilized to silence dissent. So Telegram's case demonstrated Russia's government's severe financial and technical limitations and enforcing online restrictions. And instead, the Russian authorities opted to selectively punish the ordinary citizens by accusing them of online extremism. And their arbitrariness of whole process often has to do with initiatives of particular officials and doesn't represent a centralized and institutional approach. And I would say that this facilitates collective self-censorship against the backdrop of the government's recent attempts to make internet access contingent on disclosing user identity, which allows for comprehensive surveillance of their online behavior. And to conclude, I would say that Russia is building bridges abroad while erecting firewalls at home. I will stop here. Thank you.
Not much. So our next speaker is Scott Radnitz of the University of Washington.
So in recent years, the Kremlin has become notorious for accusing its various internal opposition of being some kind of fifth column, whether it's journalists or non-governmental organizations. The Kremlin has accused them of being in league with the West or the CIA in particular. But the use of fifth column accusations actually enjoys a much longer pedigree, going back hundreds of years, and maybe most prominently being used during the Cold War, and more recently in Eastern Europe, among populist regimes, in particular by Orban in Hungary, Erdogan and Turkey, mostly seen as means to consolidate the regime. So what I'm presenting today is kind of an early study of the use of fifth columns in all post-Soviet countries, not just Russia, to try to understand both how many there are, where they take place, when they take place, in an effort to eventually kind of get to why they're used. So briefly, we have to go through definitions. A fifth column is a distrusted domestic group suspected of acting nefariously against some national interest in cooperation with external rivals of the state. I divide fifth columns into three types. The most common one, at least these days, and the one that's most commonly seen in Russia, is what I call subversive, which refers to collaboration of people with presumed ideological grievances against the state who get support from outside. Ethnic fifth columns have been prominent in other parts of the world and still are, and this refers to people with presumed ethnically based grievances who also receive outside support. And then a third kind, which isn't recognized so much, is what I call collusive, which is when politicians, people in power, are alleged to be sponsored from abroad. And so here you kind of get the claim of puppeteering, right? A puppet master controlling a president from across the world. Some examples of each quickly. Subversive claim, and these are all from a data set that I collected, which I'll talk about in a sec. Hillary Clinton gave the signal to anti-Putin demonstrators in the Bolotnaya protest in 2011. Ethnic claim comes from 2010 when there were terrorist attacks in a Moscow metro. The claim was that Georgian special services are maintaining contacts with militants in the North Caucasus. There's a Georgian trace in the Moscow metro attacks. And a collusive fifth column claim is Yeltsin's assault on the Duma and murder of hundreds of people in 1993. It was a well-planned operation backed by the West to frighten Russia. So what I'm presenting today comes from a larger project, which will eventually result in a book about conspiracy claims in post-Soviet countries. I've spent a few years accumulating a data set of Russian language conspiracy claims in all post-Soviet countries. The way I did this, though, is I selected 42 critical events. These are events that are often associated with conspiracy theories, like elections, protests, assassinations, or other violent episodes. And then I sample 1 week before and 1 week after that event. So I take a 2-week chunk, and then I use a whole lot of sources, and I use 21 keywords that I found through a process of looking at what often leads to identification of conspiracy theories. The critical point, though, is that looking at 1 week before and 1 week after the event allows me to, in a sense, control for the event, to see what independent effect the event has on the production of conspiracy theories, or in this case, of fifth column claims. I have about 1,100 total conspiracy claims. Of those, about 17% are fifth column claims. What's a fifth column claim? According to my data set, it's when there are two perpetrators alleged, one inside the country and one outside the country, and that there's some claim of collaboration, that there's the use of some verb like support, sponsor, something like that. Okay, so I'm just going to present kind of a brief overview without drawing any firm conclusions, but kind of laying things out. So these are, each bar represents one of the 42 events. Notice there are a lot of zeros, there are a lot of claims early on, mostly between 1995 and 9/11, with the exception of the Serbian Revolution, in which there were no fifth column claims made in that 2-week period. There were a bunch in both Ukrainian events in the data set. Euromaidan, of course, takes pride place, but also the Orange Revolution, and then another event preceding it also had a lot also associated with Ukraine. Following that, the Georgia War in 2008 and Kyrgyzstan's Tulip Revolution were also associated with fifth column claims. I break that down according to the 3 types that I mentioned earlier. What's worth noting here is that there aren't that many ethnic fifth column claims, for whatever reason. The majority are subversive, right? They claim that somebody in the opposition, some rival to power, is supported from abroad. And then collusive claims occur at particular times. We may forget now, but in the 90s there were a lot of claims that the Yeltsin government and his reformers were being somehow sponsored and manipulated by the IMF or from the West, and those account for some of the early collusive claims which happened in Russia. And then over toward here there are 2 pretty tall blue dots, which are claims about collusive fifth column activity. One of them is the Georgia War, which is Russia claiming that the Georgian government is working for the West. And in Euromaidan, in reverse, it was the Ukrainian opposition making claims about Yanukovych's doing the bidding of the Kremlin. I'll show these 2 together. I'll start with this one. So where does the fifth column activity occur? So this is the place in which the fifth column activity is alleged to occur, not the place of origin of the accuser. So the accusations are about where? About things that take place in Ukraine and Russia, and to some extent Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, North Caucasus, and then I put all the disputed territories, the de facto states, into one category. But the claimant is not necessarily the person who lives in that country, whose making the accusations? Well, it's mostly Russians. It's not necessarily the Russian government. It's often editorialists for certain newspapers like Sovietskaya Rossiya. Also experts, various experts, people in think tanks, people like Dugin, intellectuals, whatever you want to call them. So Russia. So that means that Russians are making some claims about Russia, but also Russians are making many claims about Ukraine and about Georgia. One other thing worth noting here is that there are not that many fifth column claims that emanate from nasty authoritarian regimes, right? We tend to think if you believe that fifth columns are used as a tool of consolidation of power, the most consolidated authoritarian regimes actually do not use fifth column tropes that often. Russia does quite a bit. Good. So then, to wrap up, there is an increase over time, which you can kind of see in this colorful graph, especially around the time that you would expect it to increase when the color revolutions began. Russians really kind of set the agenda. It doesn't mean that people in other countries are not making claims about their own oppositions or leaders, and they were in some cases, but Russia really did kind of set the agenda. The most common, the most frequent subversive claims occurred during a very small number of events, though, and these are mostly revolutions or attempted revolutions. And that indicates that certain kinds of events, the outbreaks of certain unexpected destabilizing events, is more likely to lead to fifth column claims. And one particular way to check that is to see the proportion of fifth column claims that occur in the week before or the week after the event. And it turns out that 2/3 of the fifth column claims occur in the week after the event happens, which means that the event is causing a reaction. The collusive events occurred in the 90s, and in particular geopolitical events in which the president or the government was seen to be backed by one of the two major geopolitical powers. And so this leads to a preliminary conclusion, which about 75% sure that fifth column, as they're most often articulated, are not used so much strategically to seed the ground, although you can find traces of them early on, not in response to anything in particular, but that you really see them used as a tool to react to unexpected destabilizing events, to provide an accounting and also to mobilize people for some kind of response. And that's all. Thanks.
Sure. Next we'll have Ted Gerber of the University of Wisconsin.
Okay, thank you. So what I'm here to talk about today is results of some research I conducted recently with my colleague Jane Zawiska at the University of Arizona. And the question we're addressing is, how do the experiences of labor migrants in Russia influence their perceptions of Russia? So there's been a lot of work recently, emerging body of literature on labor migration. And a lot of the literature on labor migrants in Russia portrays their experiences there as being very dire, desperate, difficult. Scholarly observers, journalists, advocacy groups such as Human Rights Watch describe a situation of rampant police harassment, exploitation, and abuse on the part of employers, also by other government officials, intermediaries, hostile contacts with locals who are racist against Central Asians in particular. And this would suggest, if this picture that has emerged, and perhaps it could be changed a little bit in light of some more recent work, but that would suggest that you would expect migrants who experience these difficulties have a pretty negative view of their host society. I mean, who wants to be harassed by the police, exploited by employers, and so on and so forth. And yet, these migrant flows from Central Asia in particular persist, suggesting that maybe the picture is a little bit more complicated than that. So we sought to collect some systematic data rather than focusing on some of the more extreme cases of abuse that one can easily read about if you look on, search the press and the scholarly literature on this topic. So we conducted 2 focus groups with returned migrants in Bishkek in November of 2016. And then we conducted a survey with an oversample of returned migrants, as well as also, in fact, internal migrants in Bishkek and the surrounding Chuy Oblast in 2017. And we wanted to test the ideas that emerged from the focus groups with the survey data. So the core arguments that we developed based on our empirical data from the focus group phase was that, in fact, Kyrgyz migrants in Russia have diverse experiences. They're not just uniformly bad. And when they talk, these are migrants who we interviewed while they're back in Bishkek. And overwhelmingly, what came to mind when they thought about their experiences were not abuse and exploitation, but the economic benefits of migration. So that's not terribly surprising. Another theme that came up in the focus group was the sense of the Kyrgyz migrants that although they recognize that they feel they're discriminated against as Central Asians, or they said things like, well, Russians think we're inferior and so forth, they nonetheless felt that they were better treated and better viewed than migrants from Tajikistan and from Uzbekistan. And there are various reasons for this, but in their own perception, they said it's mainly because they're better educated, they speak Russian better than their fellow migrants from the neighboring countries. And then finally, what we found is that the Kyrgyz migrants, they brought home from them actually rather positive impressions of Russia. And they spoke highly of their experiences there. Yes, they did recount, as we'll see, some of the types of hostility and police harassment and difficult crowded living conditions that are reported in the literature. But by and large, these were sort of dwarfed by their more positive experiences. And then, so our survey data, which we've begun to look at, and I'll show some results from, they confirm this overall impression. So I'll show you a little bit about that. So this project, I need to acknowledge with gratitude the support of the Minerva Initiative of the U.S. Department of Defense. Okay, so there's a tendency to paint migrants in broad strokes, and we can talk about this some, it's perhaps I'm oversimplifying here, but I say there's 3 broad ways that migrants in Russia are portrayed, as well as migrants in other countries. One is that they're portrayed as a threat. They take jobs, they commit crimes. That a lot of discourse by public officials in Russia, for example, and by various movements, anti-migrant movements, adopts this imagery. Second, advocates tend to portray migrants as victims. They're exploited, they're harassed, they're tormented. And then finally, there are some who, revolting against this victim imagery, say, well, actually, they're heroes. They save the economy, they provide services, they're brave, they're bold, they're resourceful, they bring human capital to the country. These are sort of 3 different tropes that characterize migrants in many countries. But we think these are a little bit they're all sort of oversimplify the picture. And so we're trying to portray, and from migrants from Central Asia in particular, they have particularly difficult experience because of their phenotypical differences, their language differences in many cases, and yet they share the Soviet culture. We see a lot of differences by country of origin in other contexts. So a lot of the work on migrants in general focuses on Central Asia. So that's one point, that the Central Asian migrant experience may differ from, say, the Ukrainian, Moldovan, or Polish, other migrants from all over the world in Russia, the American migrants in Russia. And so we want to ask, are there geopolitical implications of these experiences related to Russian soft power? So that's what the theme of this panel is, so that's what I want to focus on here. Okay, so here's just some data, shows that rates of migration to Russia have been increased for some time. There's some evidence that they slowed down a little bit after the economic crisis following the tensions of 2014, but they really didn't slow down that much, according to data that Sergei Ryazantsev has presented. All right, so our focus groups, we conducted a whole bunch of focus groups, part of the larger study of housing, but the main 2 I'm going to focus on today are those 2 in 2016 we did with returned migrants. And the findings are that, again, economic motivations were nearly universal for migration. Housing needs, the need to pay for marriages, wedding feasts, and so forth, drove a lot of the people to migrate. In Kyrgyzstan, so it's interesting to contrast some of this to the similar focus groups we ran in Ukraine. But what was interesting is that in Kyrgyzstan, the migrants first decided to go to Russia, and then they looked for jobs, and they tried to figure it out. Whereas the migrants from Ukraine, whom we interviewed in our focus groups, they almost universally were offered a job or given an opportunity, a very specific, concrete opportunity before migrating. That's what motivated them to migrate. So we did encounter in the Kyrgyzstan groups the same sorts of problems with documents, with police harassment and so forth, low wages, exploitation by employers that are covered in the literature. However, we found also that they reported some successes. They spoke of their friends who are acquaintances who had settled permanently in Russia, who were well off, and they themselves, by and large, intended to return to Russia. And they also described this Kyrgyz exceptionalism that I mentioned. They didn't really report any cases of mistreatment by the local population. I mean, reports by mistreatment by the police were more common. No negative reception. Oh, we asked them about the customs union or the Eurasian Economic Union. This was in 2016, so it was sort of just starting to take hold. They were just starting to become aware of it. They didn't really say that it had much of an impact on their experiences. And they had overwhelmingly positive views of Russia. So there's some quotations in the memo. I'm not going to sit here and go through them, but they flush out a lot of these kinds of themes. I don't really have time to go through them in detail, but we can talk about some of them. So here's some examples of briefly touch on this. So people spoke of there are a lot of Kyrgyz in Russia who get citizenship. They don't want to return. They said, why should we go back to Kyrgyzstan? There's nothing for us there, and so forth. The one fellow recently went back and talked about the great time he had with his Kyrgyz hosts, who are now who used to be living 4 to 5 in a room, but now they have their own apartment, and they ate a bunch of lamb, 5 lambs in 15 days. Pretty good fare there. Okay, so then this Kyrgyz exceptionalism, some examples of that. Some sense of negative attitudes on the part of natives, but they at the same time a sense that the Kyrgyz are better treated than their fellow migrants from the other countries. Then finally, most importantly, this positive views of Russia. And the positive views of Russia are rooted, of course, in a sense of gratitude, appreciation for the wages that the Kyrgyz can earn there, and how that, the people even who weren't migrating would say in the focus groups, well, Russia fed us, Russia saved us. But it goes deeper than that. There is also a sense in some cases that Russia is well run, things operate well, it has a strong and growing economy, it has effective government, has a very strong leader, all these kinds of things, which from the perspective of Kyrgyz kind of make sense, if they don't necessarily make sense from the perspective of people from other countries. Okay, so then briefly I'll touch on the survey data. So we have, and I don't have time to go through too many details about it. So the sample we had, migrants to Russia, or return migrants from Russia. We had return migrants from other countries as well. And then we had non-migrants. And it's interesting to compare across these 3 groups. And really the crux of what I want to show. So we did have we asked them about their experiences. So here's some data just showing, how many, the crowded living conditions. So 60% of the migrants in Russia said that they had shared a room with non-relatives. So that's a lot. If you think about sharing a room with a non-relative, it means it's a really crowded, lack of privacy, difficult housing conditions. And we did have some. Here we asked them about various types of abuse. So harassment by the police was the most common, but harassment by and even then only 36% said that they were harassed by the police once or more often than once, which is far from a majority, as you will note. Even fewer said they were harassed by local government or exploited by employers, around 15% in those cases. All right, but overall, what I really want to stress, the punchline, given the theme of the topic, is this. So we asked about views of Russia, 4 different dimensions of Russia, none of which is about the economy, none of which is explicitly related to, the remittances, the material remittances, material wages that the migrants gain. So we asked about Russia's system of social protection, about the situation with respect to freedom of speech, equality before the law, and then Russian foreign policy. And for all 4 of these measures, the return migrants from Russia stand out as significantly more positive about Russia than either the non-migrants, and then in most cases as well, the migrants who went to places other than Russia. So that provides some statistical data that backs our basic claim, which is that in addition to bringing back monetary remittances, migrants to Kyrgyzstan also have been bringing back what we call geopolitical remittances, which is a positive view of Russia. And we think this should be taken into account when thinking about soft power, when thinking about migration and its impact. And in addition to economic and political struggles, there's of course a big debate about migration in the United States. We should also take into account the potential impact that migrant experiences have on views of the host country. Спасибо за внимание.
Okay, and we are also very happy that Wayne Mary of the American Foreign Policy Council has agreed to offer his thoughts on the memos and general topic. So we'll turn things over to him, and then we'll open things up to the discussion with the audience.
Thank you, Henry. I appreciate being here. I mean, after all of the years that I have consumed Honar's products, not to mention consuming your coffee and your bagels, it's probably only just that you should put me to work for once. If you look at the topic for this overall panel, it's a very broad one. In and out, Russia's levers of influence at home and abroad. I mean, that would accommodate not just 4 papers, but 400 papers without any particular difficulty. So, I mean, there's not a unity among these 4 papers as there might be in one of the other panels, but they're all trying to look at a different aspect of Russia's relationship with the outside world in contemporary terms. And I think it's characteristic that 2 of the papers are about the cyber world, which definitely shows the Honars of the 21st century. But they're looking at things through different facets of this very, very complex lens. I will confess that the first paper, the one on the Twitter bots, was the one that I enjoyed the most. Frankly, because I found it fun. Getting into the methodology that they used here, I thought was really intriguing, particularly when you start looking at the scatter map, the multicolor scatter map that they did. And I want to say very forcefully that I think this paper represents what's potentially the cutting edge of a whole new field of potential research. That if these guys could, with the methodology that they had and the limited resources they had, produce this kind of detailed information, what might you be able to do with more resources and more time and effort? I mean, I'm sure our researcher agrees with me, but I want to make that point. I think this is a field for further research and expansion and study. And there's a lot of potential in that. I say that as a person who doesn't even tweet, but the amount of information they were able to glean through purely open sources out of the Twitter sphere in Russia, I thought was extraordinary, and it left me wanting more, a lot more. What it also demonstrated, of course, was that the Russian cyber world is a lot more diverse and dynamic than many people in the West, in the United States, would imagine. I still run into people who say that, oh, are we still doing shortwave broadcasts for Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty and Voice of America into Russia? And I tell them, you got a satellite dish in Russia, you can watch BBC, you can watch Deutsche Welle. I mean, I'm sort of struck by how many Russians I know who watch Fox. And the idea that somehow Russia is this closed-off world that's impenetrable to the modern cyber world is preposterous. But this particular study demonstrates that there are a lot of people out there generating millions and tens of millions of bots that are in, at least in the views, I should think, of many Derzhavniki in Moscow, downright subversive. And yet they're doing it on a large scale, and I think that's very interesting. And I would, of course, like to see this kind of research expanded to other forms of social media. I don't think Twitter should be the only area of research. And I think, again, this is an area for an enormous potential future. The paper on hacking and banning attracted a little bit of my own inherent cynicism about the current American paranoia about hacking. In part, this is because a decade ago, the Counterterrorism Center at CIA sponsored a 5-year simulation exercise on the vulnerabilities of the United States in cybersphere, and I was one of the contractors on that. Well, I can't talk a lot about what took place in Silent Horizon. The notion that Angela Merkel just had a wide open BlackBerry, well, what did she expect? I mean, as an American taxpayer, I would want the NSA to penetrate that. I mean, what did John Podesta think when his password was password? In point of fact, the United States is not just vulnerable. The countries that are really hitting us are many and diverse. The biggest single one is China. China is the mountain, Russia a comparative molehill. North Korea, Romania, for God's sake, Moldova, is hacking the daylights out of the United States. And I'm a little worried that there seem to be serious people in the American political system who are shocked that this is actually happening. I remember that before he left office, President Obama tried to reassure people by saying that whatever the Russians have been doing to us, don't worry, we're number one. And I like to hope that that is actually still true. But what it does, I think, demonstrate also is that what all countries are doing, and this includes the United States, is what you always do in SIGINT and LINT. You're testing other sides' capabilities. You're looking for gaps. You're finding out when you test them, how do they respond? This is the oldest thing. This is why do countries fly airplanes close to other countries' borders? To see how their radar reacts, to see how their defense forces react. We do that, they do that, everybody does that. I mean, part of what this is the kind of silent game that goes on among great powers that have technical capabilities. And the notion that the Russians would not be doing this, not just with us, but how much do you think the Russians are trying to hack the Chinese, and the Chinese hacking the Russians? Now, the thing that I find surprising about Russian efforts at home is not that they are control freaks, not that they are crude, not that they involve human rights violations. I would expect nothing else. What surprises me is how ineffectual they are. When I compare my experience with my iPhone in China or in Turkey with my experience in Russia, my feeling is, why are these guys in Moscow, who are supposed to be so cutting edge in cyberspace in their attacks on us, so comparatively ineffectual in dealing what they would normally perceive as a national security problem at home? That they have to go around doing things like convicting people for putting up a silly image on Facebook. I mean, if they really wanted to control their own cyber world, they ought to be able to do it. If Erdogan can do it, Putin ought to be able to do it. And I'm a little puzzled, frankly, that they're not either more effective or more aggressive. And I suspect as time passes, they will be. That's what we have to look forward to. The whole notion of fifth columns reminds me that we are at the 50th anniversary of 1968, a year most of you won't remember, but I certainly do. Because that was a time when I would have been regarded by J. Edgar Hoover as being part of a fifth column, because I was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And even though politically I was somewhat conservative, I have no doubt that they had a file on me because a number of the people who were my friends, classmates, and roommates, one of whom later went into the Weather Underground. I mention this only because I think it is normal for someone like Vladimir Putin to be like Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon, and to assume that domestic opposition and domestic disruption must have a foreign source. This is one of the oldest tropes for authoritarian or even semi-authoritarian leaders. I don't find anything particularly unusual about it, particularly when one considers how much foreign, not just American, but foreign intrusiveness there has been in Russian politics. in the last 20 years. I mean, I think back on some of the things that I was actually myself involved in the US government, where we were doing things in Russian politics in the early 90s that were comparable to what we had done in Italy in the 1950s. And what surprises me is not that Putin finally threw out IRI and the NED and NDI and so on and so forth, but that he waited so long to do it. Given that those institutions engaged in democracy promotion were, from his perception, engaged in color revolution building and ultimately regime change. So in a sense, it's the continued openness of the Russian state to the outside world in this respect that I find unusual. Not the fact that it's closing down, though I would expect, as time goes by, that its restrictions will only increase. And finally, on the reactions of Kyrgyz to their experience in Russia, my entirely non-scientific memory of my 6 years living in Russia and the Soviet Union is that the relationship between Russians and Kyrgyz tended to be benign. The Russians I knew, when they looked at Central Asian nationalities, Caucasian nationalities, or Islamic nationalities within the Russian Federation itself, tended to be more positively disposed toward the Kyrgyz, and vice versa. My experience in Bishkek and traveling in Kyrgyzstan is that in general, you heard less bitching about Russia than you would, for example, in Uzbekistan. I'm not quite sure why that's the case, but I think there is a legacy of sort of good feeling between Russians and Kyrgyz that is reflected in this study. I find it interesting that the Kyrgyz that were interviewed said that they thought that some of the Tajiks and the Uzbeks had more problems than they did. And I think that's not too surprising. I think one of the things that was not reflected in here is I had to assume that since the study was done in the area around Bishkek, that most of those studied were actually ethnically Kyrgyz as well as by state citizenship. There is, of course, a large Uzbek minority in other parts of Kyrgyzstan, and I have a feeling that if they were studied, they might have a somewhat different experience. I remember a few years ago, there was a paper here at a Ponar's conference about Kyrgyz gastarbeiter who went to Russia, came back home and found out the Uzbeks had moved into their neighborhood, and the problems that created. What I do think this also reflects is the fact that if you're somebody at that part of the economic food chain who is a migrant worker, the chances that you're going to be treated very well in your own country by your own establishment are not of the best. And the same is true in Russia. For example, only about a third of the Kyrgyz gastarbeiter in Russia said that they had been harassed even once by the police. I think if you were to ask the native Russian population in these places, how many of you have been harassed at least once by the police, the number might be somewhat comparable. So if the Kyrgyz can go to Russia and get treatment that's not significantly worse than the Russians themselves, they're doing rather well. However, there are plenty of other migrant populations in Russia who I think are not.
Discussion off to, I think, a great start. So let me just collect a few kind of comments and questions. Yes, first.
Yeah, a question for Josh.
Please wait for the microphone. Yeah, sorry. And then if you just introduce yourself. One's coming right there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Stefan the Spiegel at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. A question for Josh. I mean, how effective are the bots actually? Not so much in terms of what they trigger as a response, but if you look at them, I mean, when we look at like Google Home or Alexa or so, we see oftentimes they still get things wrong, and we sort of now assume that these guys are super effective at formulating the algorithms that do that kind of stuff. Do you have any evidence on that? And could it also affect your categorization, that maybe some of the neutral things are just algos misfiring, just making a mistake? But my fundamental question is, you have these three interesting categories of regime responses to these kinds of things, right? So either you have the traditional, sort of repressive, put them in jail kind of stuff, the Chinese firewall stuff, and then, as you suggested, the Russian ones, more sophisticated ones. from Alexandra's presentation, you get the idea that maybe it's, that they're sort of gravitating again more towards the repressive part. So is that a contradiction? And then also the issue that was raised there, what does that tell us about the effectiveness? Is it really true that if you close things off entirely, that's really effective? Could it not be a more sophisticated strategy of leaving a sort of openness that a certain part of the population is still able to get access, and therefore you don't get more backlash from them, but you are effective in the sense that most of the population actually is under the influence of those kinds of things. So I think it's more a quite sophisticated strategy that maybe combines some of the elements of the three categories that you have. I'd be delighted to hear your response to that.
Thank you. There's a question, yes, right there.
Hi, I'm Sarah Oates from the University of Maryland. I really enjoyed all of these papers. I had and I agree with Professor Tucker that, yeah, we were doing this before it was cool. I get a t-shirt with that. But I had a question for Professor Radnitz about your paper. And I'm wondering if, and I loved your framing of it, but I'm wondering if all conspiracy theories are created equal. To paraphrase Catch-22, just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean they aren't out to get me. And the example of Euromaidan, of the Ukrainians saying, it's the Russians, it's the Russians. Is that really a conspiracy theory so much as reality? Whereas the Russians saying, oh, it's the Americans, they're behind Euromaidan. I think that has, to me, is more of a fifth column conspiracy theory. So it's kind of like, are all conspiracy theories created equal? And that would be my question to you. How do you cope with that?
Okay, and then in the first row here. I'll let you just introduce yourself, please.
Hi, Yuval Weber, Daniel Morgan Graduate School. This is also a question for both Scott and then a shorter one for Josh. You had a distinction between basically Russians being more open to conspiracy theories than, let's say, people across the rest of the region. So why is that in your sense? It reminded me, like when you were speaking, is that from Kennan's long telegram, he's talking about the Bolsheviks work by conspiracy, and therefore that goes throughout the entire society. So is it in a sense that Russians are more open because it demonstrates international relevance? Like, of course, the foreigners, the Americans, the whomever, are going to try to influence our politics. And in a sense, why aren't the other autocracies also open to it? Is it that they don't want to allow their experts and surrogates to go on air in Bishkek or wherever else? To suggest that the fifth column is there, but implication they're not as strong as you think, things of that nature. So why is there some sort of country to country difference? And when thinking about who orders what, the question for Josh is, and I saw an earlier version of this paper at ACES last year, and it's actually gotten much more sophisticated since then, so it's good to see things are improving. So a question that was maybe reflects or echoes Professor Coates over there, who is ordering these neutral algorithms? Who are the people who are enthusiastic about just centrism? So, thank you.
Okay, let me take just a couple more. Let's see. So let's go.
Alexei Garay from Kyiv Mohila Academy and honors member. Actually, my question would be to the commentator. So you have compared to a certain extent what Mr. Putin doing with the experience of under Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. So as far as I remember, Lyndon Johnson decided not to run in 1968 and Mr. Nixon stepped down. So could we expect something?
All right, let me just take the two last comments. So right here in the front row and then the middle of the third row.
Hi, I'm Natasha Yefimova-Trilling from Russia Matters. And to Professor Yatsyk and Tucker, I wanted to just ask, insofar as, well, bouncing off of what Wayne Mary said about, I'm surprised, he was surprised to see that Russia isn't being more aggressive and more repressive. In your research, have you found things that forestall or mitigate that, or really are there constituencies within Russia perhaps that would be hurt significantly by a greater interventionism, state interventionism in the freedom of the internet, and hence they are working also to sort of keep that from happening?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, then she rose back. And then we'll go basically in the order that we started with.
Maria Smith, Department of State. Thank you for your talks, Professor Radnitz. I was interested, it's slightly off topic, but what are some of the other prominent categories of conspiracy theories? And are there any with foreign policy significance in your view other than the fifth column ones?
Okay, terrific. So let's just go in the order we started. I know kind of there are a lot for Josh, but just try to keep it as brief as you can, just so we have time for another round, and I'll keep lists.
Sure. Okay, great. So thanks so much. Thanks for the kind comments. I will start off by saying anyone who thinks that there should be more funding directed to this research, please come see me afterwards. I have lots of materials I can give you. They're already prepared. We're very excited about this. Okay, so but thanks to the discussion for the very kind comments. So on the question of like, there's sort of two statements of questions. One is about the strategic choices, and the other is like the how effective are the bots, right? What are they doing? So. And then there's the Yuval's question of like, who's putting out these neutral bots and this sort of thing. So let me just take those in turn. On how effective are the bots? This is a great question, right? Like I just headlined this big report from the Hewlett Foundation, which for anyone who's sort of interested in this area, it's like this 90-page lit review. We brought all these scholars together to work on this. That's on the relationship between social media, political polarization, and disinformation. And it ends with a sort of 20-page section on research gaps and data needs. And in particular, this is one of the questions we don't know. We're beginning to be able to do research like this on finding bots and detecting bots. We know very little about how humans respond to bots as opposed to how they respond to other humans. We know very little about whether humans can tell whether they're interacting with a bot or not. There's just a couple of studies on this that have been done, and they have nothing to do with politics. So for the funding, that's a great source of thing that we want to do. We want to know how people respond to these things. But the tying question about the effectiveness goes to Yuval's question, which is I want to be really clear. Neutral bots are not moderate bots. They're not pro-centrists. This was a residual category. We categorized these things of which of these bots seem to be pushing the Kremlin line, which seem to be pushing the opposition line, which seem to be pro-Ukrainian in the Ukraine versus Russia conflict. What a lot of these bots are doing is tweeting news headlines. So I don't think they're misfiring. I think this is a strategy that news media uses running the gamut around the world, that when you publish an article, you tweet the headline. Now, what we normally see in this regard is you see the headline with a link and a little picture, like you want people to click on it. What was so interesting about this was that we were seeing all these news headlines being tweeted without a link, right? And so then that raises a real question about whether the intended audience of that is a person at all. And what we think, and there are different explanations for why they might be doing this. There's the Occam's razor explanation, though, is that they're not trying to have any effect on humans. What they're trying to do is fool other algorithms. Or they're trying to have an effect on other algorithms, which is essentially search optimization algorithms, right? And for those of you who, in Russia, you know trending topics on Yandex and this sort of stuff. So this is around the same time period. I think Yandex we have this long case study in the comparative politics article with us. Yandex ends up removing the trending topics from the Yandex homepage. And so I think this was a very rational way to be affecting it. They could be doing other things, right? If you wanted to hide from Twitter, trying to find out which accounts were bots, and you wanted some sort of thing to trigger random posts at random times, so you didn't look like you were never acting, but you didn't look like you were acting in a very regular way, a really good algorithm would be every time this newspaper headline changes its front page, take the first 7 words on the front page and tweet it. Right, so maybe there's much more complicated, sophisticated things going on in that regard. We don't know, but Occam's razor is it was about search engine optimization, which cuts into the effectiveness of, well, what do we mean when a bot is effective, right? If a bot is designed to fool algorithms, or not fool algorithms, manipulate algorithms, then that's very different than being effective in the sense of trying to fool a human being. The other question, which leads into this, which is this question about why the different strategies. Why is Russia? And I'll make a point, and I apologize for this. I forgot to put this up. There are 3 papers related to this project. I mentioned the one in comparative politics, which has the framework, and it has a very long Russian case study in the appendix, 18 pages on sort of going through why Russia chose different types of these strategies. So I refer people to that. But we also have an entire paper, a very technical paper on the bot detection method that appeared in the Journal of Big Data at the end of 2017. And on the coding of the orientation, we have an article that's forthcoming in a special issue on social media and politics at Sage Open. So there are papers that detail exactly how these methods work. And then, as I said, we're working towards the final paper where we're going to be looking at testing strategies and testing, empirical support for questions about how these accounts have been used. But just very briefly, on that question of why might you not do what the Chinese do and repress and things, that's expensive. I mean, that's where this whole project started, was like, the biggest goal of this project is could we eventually have a model and a theory that predicts across time and space why different regimes pursue different strategies in terms of dealing with online opposition. And the Chinese model, I think everyone would think it was great, but they've got, hundreds of thousands of people involved in this. They're paying individual citizens. It's a major operation. And so early on, and then there's also consequences for removing content, right? You shut down the whole internet, yeah, nobody's gonna see what somebody posted on Facebook, but nobody's gonna see what somebody posted on Instagram, right? Like Molly Roberts has this phenomenal paper where she shows that when the Chinese suddenly restricted access to Instagram, everybody went and got VPNs, right? Which they weren't getting before, and then they got those VPNs and started going to Google and Facebook and other sites and things like that. So there's all sorts of trade-offs here. So I would suggest originally, this was a simpler strategy. It's much cheaper to hire a bunch of people to program a bunch of bots, and who knows, we don't even know if the government hired people to program bots, or these were commercial outfits that were trying to attract the attention of the government by showing that they could make these bots that would do things political to get their notice so that maybe corporate clients would pick up and use them for other things and pay them to do things. We don't really know anything about where this came from. But I do think this, just saying we're going to restrict access to content, that we jump to that because that's what we're used to in terms of censorship. It's an interesting question. I'd love to talk to people in the government who are talking about this, right? Because there is a legacy argument to think like, oh, you would immediately, people who had worked under the Soviet Union and experienced some censorship. But remember as well, the Russian model for a long time was, we are going to control what, under Putin, we are going to control what is on television. And we're going to give people freedom to do other things. And that, there were very good reasons why they did that. And so, this most recent steps of sort of striking down, I think, are putting a toe in this other direction. And there will be costs to doing that, but maybe now the resources are there, the technology makes it easier, it's 4 or 5 years later. So, anyway.
That's a lot of questions efficiently managed. Very good. Yes,
Actually, Josh has already answered this question. Yes, unfortunately, it is really expensive to create this Russian version of Chinese firewall. And the second point, I think, why it is not possible, because this experience with Telegram's banning, which actually brought, as I said, significant financial damages to Russian companies, and of course they were not happy because of these damages and damage. And the third thing, which is also mentioned, that the approach to ban Russian online freedom is not centralized, so it is not institutionalized. So it means that there are different strategies with which applied by different actors, by individuals, by the state, by other agencies, and they are not centralized, fortunately, again. And I would also say that mentality of Russian people is also different. And because of it's also much cheaper to control certain people, to punish them, and they also is grounded in Russian history from Stalin's time. I mean, it's much more understandable for Russians to apply this approach, to apply this system, to punish, to apply the coercion, and it's also cheaper. But I think the key answer is that it's cheaper, and to create this Chinese version is very expensive. And actually, I heard that by political scientist Valery Solovey, who said that by 2012, Russia will close Russian internet. But hopefully not. Let's see. And to your question, as I understood, they also asked about this ineffectiveness and whether it is consistent or not. And as I said, that it is a not centralized system, so that's why it is not a consistent approach. That's why it's so ineffective.
And other than the people at companies hurt by the Telegram thing, for example, are there internal constituencies that at some level, make attempts to make sure that the government doesn't get more aggressive? Or is it mostly reactive? When that happens, is it mostly reactive, like with the Telegram thing?
We try to prevent these actions.
Commercially,
yes.
Okay, great, thanks. Scott.
So first, The question about earlier. The question about definitions of conspiracy theories is a question I get most often. It can be very tricky sometimes. So what I do is I apply the same criteria to every potential conspiracy theory that my research assistants come across, and that is that in addition to meeting the ordinary definitional components that has to be applied by a small number of people for nefarious purposes, the claim must be at least one leap beyond conventionally acceptable evidence. And so you can quibble with what evidence that is, and different people looking at the same event will have different notions of what's a conspiracy theory and what's not. Of course, some conspiracy theories are true because there are actual conspiracies, but the point is that the claim must be something beyond what the people who are claiming it could actually know and could logically have been able to infer at the time. Which means that, are they created equal? I'd say is the wrong question. I don't try to make a symmetry between pro-American or pro-Russian claims. I try to, as much as well, disassociate the definition from the geopolitical surroundings and look at the claim in the context. On the question of why there seems to be so much Russia, so I should note that the fifth column claims were less than 20% of my total data set, and in the overall data set, Russian accusations are actually only about 40% of the total. So this is actually not representative. It seems like, so Russians hear about 80% of the claims about fifth columns. So there's a particular attraction of fifth column rhetoric in Russia. But more broadly, Russia's about 40% of the total. There's a pretty large number in Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan and Georgia. And the disputed territories, what do those have in common? Those are hybrid or competitive regimes. And the bar plot that showed that there weren't that many in the more consolidated authoritarian regimes is also consistent with the result in the larger data set. There's simply, dictators do not see the need to promote conspiracy claims as often. I have some notions about why that is. I think it may not be necessary, right? There may be perceived costs to promoting conspiracy theories too much. And so whether you see Russia being 40% of the total as a lot or little, depends on your perspective. So Russia's a very big country, has about half the population of the post-Soviet region, so maybe it's less than you'd expect, or maybe it's more than you'd expect. In any case, I wanted to just map it out and find out who's claiming what and where and when. And the question of the other categories, so the fifth column categorization is, those three categories are 3 out of 20 possible types of perpetrators. So the other perpetrators could be foreign government or other foreign actors, the military, opposition, media, criminals, hackers. So there's a whole variety, and they're not. The other types aren't so easily classifiable into pithy labels. But I do code every conspiracy claim that I collect by who the perpetrator is, who the accuser is, and where they're from, and who the victim is, and what their nationality is. Do they have foreign policy implications? Probably. But that's a question for another day.
Okay, thanks, Ted.
Thanks, yeah. So I didn't get any questions, so I'm off the hook, but I will respond to Wayne's point regarding the potential geographic specificity. And indeed, yes, of course, I mean, there's large concentrations of Uzbek minorities in the south. Some of them undoubtedly also participate, but it's not all. I mean, there's many Kyrgyz from the south who live in the south as well, and a lot of them also migrate. But it's a point well taken that it would be great to expand this research and to survey or conduct focus groups in other regions of Kyrgyzstan. We did do some focus groups, in fact, in Osh and in some nearby villages in the early phases of this project, but we weren't focused at that point on the migration issue, although we did hear a lot of very similar things just randomly from those focus groups. And it would be great, there are growing efforts to study the experiences of migrants to Russia and other Central Asian countries, Tajikistan in particular. Who knows, maybe soon we'll be able to do some research in Uzbekistan. But thanks for the points, absolutely.
Wait.
The key difference between Putin's situation and that of Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon is retirement. I mean, LBJ went back and lived in the beautiful Texas Hill Country. Nixon went off and lived in San Clemente on the Pacific coast. And while Gerald Ford's pardon of Nixon was extremely controversial, probably cost him the election, it was never in any serious way challenged. And this is what's missing in Russia. How do you retire? How do you retire in safety, and how do you retire in comfort? Fundamentally, what Russia needs is some kind of Colombele dos Églises, where the great leader can go off and write memoirs and be essentially untouchable. I don't see that developing. And given that Mr. Putin's evident health is such that he stands a good chance of living into his 90s, but doubtless has no desire to end up like Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev did, this creates a fundamental problem in Russian politics, is how does this man retire? I mean, he doesn't want to end up like Brezhnev, he doesn't want to end up like Stolypin, but he's going to have to end up somehow.
Okay, thanks. We have about 5 minutes left, so maybe time for a couple more questions. Let's see, I thought there was somebody standing there. Did you have a, yeah? No? Okay, all right, so let's, okay, yes, please. And then the gentleman, kind of a couple rows ahead of her.
Hi, it's Cynthia Buckley from the University of Illinois, and I've got a couple of quick questions for Professor Gerber on the attitudinal remittances. And Ted, this is really exciting work because research on Bangladeshi migrants, for example, who are going into the incredibly repressive Gulf states, come back to Bangladesh with improved perceptions about living standards, individual possibilities in the Gulf states. So it only stands to reason to bring Russia and its relationship to Central Asia into this conversation. So 3 quick things. First of all, in terms of the Kyrgyz migrants, do you have any insights from the focus groups or surveys about what they perceive as other options for destinations other than Kazakhstan? You've got about 105 going elsewhere. Are most of them heading over to Kazakhstan or not? And that's linked into this issue of, is it ethnicity or is it labor market segmentation? What are the jobs Kyrgyz migrants are taking in Russia as opposed to some of the jobs that are taken by those who are seen as more exploited? Certainly exploitation possibilities differ by segment of the labor market. And then the last one is time. If you could share with us any insights, is it the fact that people who are more positively oriented towards Russia are more likely to migrate to Russia and keep those attitudes when they come back? Or did you get any sense from the focus groups about a change over time or an acceleration of their positive feelings?
Okay, then two rows ahead.
Hi, it's Alexandra from George Mason. One comment I haven't heard it mentioned when discussing complications of Russian internet censorship is that Russia is one of the few countries where the domestic internet industry, where Russian entrepreneurs pride themselves on the fact that in Russia, the domestic internet industry is bigger than the foreign, like Vkontakte and Yandex. And so I was wondering, how could the market be affected in the future given the trends in the legal and censorship? And a question to Dr. Yatsyk about the extremism law. Is my understanding correct that it's unpopular in Russia and it's seen as backward? And if so, then could you imagine Putin maybe stepping in and playing the populist hero like he did, basically with scrapping the law, like he did with retirement reform in 2005 when he canceled it? And like when a couple weeks ago, he said, we're going to adjust the retirement age, it's not going to be as steep as we expected.
Okay, yeah, so maybe let's just take one more very quick, be quick, we only have about 4 minutes left. Second row.
Hi, I'm David, first year student at Elliott. My question is for Mr. Gerber. Do you see a difference in attitude toward, these Central Asian migrants between kind of like urban areas as opposed to rural areas? And for Ms. Yatsyk, how prepared is the Russian state to counter, cyber or like kind of like propaganda against the Russian state from outside countries?
Okay, thank you. So let's just turn to our panelists, and I'd say kind of 30 seconds for Josh, a minute for Alexandra, two for Ted, because he hasn't had a chance to talk yet, and any comments Wayne wants to make, so, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'll say is like, we have a detailed write-up in this case study about what happened with Bukontakte, and that's an example of essentially, you know, if this grand theory was to emerge about the options that regimes have for controlling online conversations and dealing with online opposition, it's going to have something to do with this question of domestic ownership and foreign ownership. It's obviously very different when your whole citizenry is using Twitter, like you find in Saudi Arabia, and when a lot of your citizenry is on Bukontakte, which is a domestic company, and they did push out the founder of Bukontakte and put in more pliant, leadership there. The danger, of course, on that, and this goes back to this question of what are the ramifications that we were talking about before, is that if you make a platform that people like into something that they don't like, they'll flee to other options. This is sort of the classic Hirschman exit and voice type arguments about things. So it's always a kind of delicate game to play. Bukontakte, and there are people who know much more about this than I do, but I do think Bukontakte has kind of emerged as the social media for pro-Russia patriots, and that this is, the opposition goes and hangs out on Facebook, and Bukontakte has, so I think Bukontakte survived this, although we don't know what it would have been in the absence of the leadership turnover.
So as I understood, Bukontakte has finally agreed to cooperate with Facebook, so to provide personal data there. So I mean, it means that Bukontakte lost this game, I think. So I don't believe that this extremist law might be cancelled. So I think that it's not possible, just not possible. And this is not the way how Russia will follow. And if I understood your question right, so how to counteract this Russian propaganda? You don't recognize with fake news. First, of course, you have to read the mass media with different positions. And also, as I know, there is a very interesting report about how Russian trolls created propaganda during these Trump elections. And it was very well detailed explanation how to recognize this fake news and how these, especially videos on YouTube, were created with different sources and how to understand that this is a fake. So this is a very useful tool if you are interested.
Thank you. Scott.
I didn't get any questions on this round, but I'll just maybe mention that while big data is great, I want to put in a plug for medium and small data, which maybe should be rebranded as like awesome data or super data or fun data or something. And I know you're a good reader, but I don't think you read all 36 million tweets. I read every one of the 1,778 conspiracy theories multiple times, and it makes me crazy.
Well, great. Thank you for the question. So, the main destinations for the migrants in the sample who went elsewhere other than Russia were, first place Kazakhstan, then China, and then Turkey, and then a smattering, to European and various other places. And they actually differ in some interesting ways from the Russian migrants. So initially, the Russia migrants were less likely to be employed, more likely to be unemployed, while abroad the migrants to other countries were less likely to have worked. So a lot of that is education migration, or they're much more likely. So Kyrgyz, at least based on our geographically limited sample, when they go abroad to work, they're more likely to go to Russia. When they go abroad to study, they're more likely to go to other countries. But there's obviously some of each in both types of destinations. Also, when they get back, the Russian migrants, they actually have higher rates of unemployment, but among those employed, they have higher wages. So, and you can explain this in terms of reservation wage, right? So they have this experience of working in Russia, making good money. They come back, they're not going to take some crappy job, but there's no such effect with respect to the non-Russian migrants. So it is an interesting set of contrasts with respect to the rural-urban differences. So we have a largely urban sample. I mean, there are some villages in Chuy Oblast, which are not super rural because they're all kind of suburbs of Bishkek. And so I can't really address that particular distinction, but we will, of course, be looking at multivariate models to look at other sources of variation in views of Russia other than the migration experience. And I don't know, Cindy, of course, people are going to hit me with possible endogeneity. And of course, right, if you're a big fan of Russia, you're more likely to go to Russia than to other countries. And so I don't really have a good quick answer to that. I mean, I don't think there's any good instruments. I might be able to come up with something. But you know, it's a point well taken, and certainly you know, it's a common type of problem. I can't, you know, I have to go back and look more carefully, because yeah, one strategy would be to dive down deeper into those transcripts and say, did people talk about how, you know, did they say things? Well, when I first went there, I expected this to happen, but then my attitudes improved. So I can't offer that or address that offhand. So stay tuned. I'll certainly maybe have more to say later. Thank you.
Okay, Wayne, so final. Thank you. Okay. All right, well, thank you very much. But before thanking all of our panelists, just want to make a brief announcement about lunch. So we have, Marlene can correct me or add any information that I may miss, but we have box lunches for people outside in the little kind of common space right outside the room.
I thought you were going to say bot lunches.
Well, so we're going to have a kind of a working lunch. So I think we could say maybe we'll start at like 1:05. To give people about 15 minutes to go get a lunch, and you're invited to bring it back here into the room, and we'll have a discussion moderated by IRIS Director Peter Rolberg with George Gavrilis, and is Alex Cooley going to be joining us by Skype? So anyway, but it's on a oral history project that they've been working on based at the Harriman Institute on the Cold War and the Academy. And then after that, I'll just note for people ahead, the afternoon sessions are breakout sessions, so we'll have one session here, so just note in the program, and contemporaneously downstairs in room 505, which is one floor down, we'll have the other sessions, so you can see which ones are where, so just make a note that when we end, we'll break up like that. So please join me in thanking our